What's up, everyone? Zavi D of Organic Health Movement coming to you today to discuss the far-reaching impact of worldwide cacao production. Cacao is the raw form of the product we know and love as chocolate. The production of cacao is fraught with human rights issues, concerns over deforestation, and child labor. A little bit about cacao. It originates from the seeds of the cocoa fruits, which grow on cocoa trees. The production of cacao begins in the tropical regions around the equator, where the hot and humid climate is well suited for growing cacao trees, very similar to coffee, such that they grow in the same regions around the equator. 70% of the world's cacao beans come from 4 West African countries: the Ivory Coast, Ghana, Nigeria, and Cameroon. But by far, Ivory Coast and Ghana are the 2 largest producers of cacao. They cultivate more than half of the world's cacao raw supply. These 2 are followed by other cacao-producing countries like Indonesia, Nigeria, Cameroon, Brazil, and Ecuador. A little bit about the farming of cacao and its human impact. Worldwide, 90% of cacao is grown on small family farms of 2 to 5 hectares, while just 5% comes from large plantations of 40 hectares or more. Cacao production provides livelihoods for between 40 and 50 million farmers, making it integral to farming practices throughout the world and deeply impactful upon human populations. In the Ivory Coast and Ghana, up to 90% of the farmers rely on cacao for their primary income. When we get to the section on the poor wages that cacao farmers earn, you'll understand why it's so important to buy high-quality sources of this product. Growing cacao is hard manual work and very labor-intensive, as caring for and harvesting the beans requires close and continuous attention. The cacao tree flowers and bears fruit throughout the entire year, which means these farmers are pretty busy. There are 3 main types of cacao plants: Forastero, Criollo, and Trinitario, which is a hybrid of the first 2 types. But by far, Forastero is now the most common commercial type because it produces beans with the strongest flavor. Now, when we break down what's actually inside the cacao pod, we find that there are about 20 to 30 seeds sitting in a sweet white pulp, and those are actually the cacao beans. It takes a whole year's crop from one tree to make half a kilo of cocoa, which is pretty insane. As pods do not ripen at the same time, the trees need to be monitored continuously, and of course variations in weather, variations in farmer availability, and variations in the deforestation processes going on in these countries that we're speaking of all impact the ability to harvest and sell cacao beans. Furthermore, cacao is a very delicate crop, meaning it's easily affected by changes in weather and is susceptible to diseases and pests. So the next step in the process of harvesting cacao beans is that of fermentation. This is important for developing the full flavor potential of the cacao bean. It's a spontaneous process conducted directly after harvesting the cacao fruit. And although fermentation is commonly performed using naturally present yeast, some chocolate manufacturers add yeast-based starter cultures that have been optimally adapted to cocoa fermentation. However, I would note here that a lot of people do have intolerances to yeast, especially those that suffer from gut hyperpermeability. So it's important to consider that those chocolate products you buy, which are naturally more processed and have more additives, likely are going to contain traces of yeast that may impact your gut microbiome, and especially for those suffering from fungal infections. I think this is important to note because even the smallest dose of yeast or any other contraindicated molecule that upsets your gut barrier integrity is going to be important to get out of your diet. The pulp of the cacao pod liquefies during fermentation. Fermentation is commonly performed in heaps covered by leaves or on wooden sweating boxes. It lasts about 5 to 7 days, and the temperature and humidity at which it takes place, as well as the frequency with which the beans are turned for aeration, determine the full flavor profile a roasted and ground bean will ultimately possess. Now, there are a few more steps in the cacao cultivation process that I could mention, but I want to focus on what's most important about this issue. A joint study conducted by the French Development Agency and Barry Callebaut, which is one of the world's largest chocolate producers, based on surveys conducted in Ivory Coast, found that farmers earned an estimated 568 West African franc, or $1 per day. Estimates can be and have been as low as 72 cents per day. Updated research from Fairtrade International, which was also conducted in Ivory Coast, shows that even farmers selling cacao with Fairtrade certification are living on the margins. Now, of course, Fairtrade is the most well-established certification for cacao, but we must consider that we can take further steps in buying chocolate that represents better direct trade practices with cacao farmers. So, fair trade requires that cocoa traders pay farmer cooperatives, not individual farmers, a minimum price, plus an additional premium for their product. But that doesn't always mean that the farmer gets to reap the benefit of that higher price. In fact, it takes time and money to achieve certification, but unfortunately, the designation doesn't ensure that farmers will be paid more money. In fact, if a cooperative can't sell its cocoa at a premium, the certified harvest may be sold at a lower price. Between September of 2016 and February of 2017, farmers saw their income drop as much as 37% from one season to the next. This is one of the issues with cacao. It's that a confluence of forces can create fluctuations in the commodity pricing. For example, in this case, analyst predictions that China and India would develop ravenous appetites for chocolate actually failed, for there was relatively flat demand in established markets, and those markets they predicted to grow did not. In short, the demand didn't meet the surplus. Because of the oversupply, the market price for a ton of cocoa went from over $3,000 to a 10-year low of $1,900. We have to consider, when we use direct trade practices, we help mitigate many of the effects of analyst predictions and stock market trading that can have devastating impacts on cacao farmers. Take into consideration now deforestation. Around 40% of Ivory Coast cacao crop, which is more than a tenth of the world's chocolate bars, is grown illegally in the country's national parks and 230 supposedly protected government-owned forests. This comes from an organization, an environmental group called Mighty Earth, that does excellent cataloging of the footprint of key global commodities. You have to understand, most cacao is grown in monocultures of what is known as the full sun system, requiring the removal of all surrounding trees. In order to meet the world's insatiable demand for beans, we have to understand that many protected areas have been converted into farms. We see this in countries like Brazil as well, where many swaths of rainforests have been completely mowed down to make way for the cultivation of genetically modified soy and corn, in order, again, to feed the world's insatiable demand for these products. Wildlife, especially forest elephants and chimpanzees, have suffered badly. The forests form part of the West African Guinea forest, famous for its primates. However, in this study that I mentioned, it was found that 13 of the 23 protected forests no longer had any primates. Pressure has been growing on the governments of countries like Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana to act. However, rather than redoubling its efforts to keep cacao growers out of its protected forests, the government of Ivory Coast plans to remove the largely ineffectual legal protection from thousands of square miles of wrecked rainforests and convert them into agroforestry reserves. Now, who benefits from these practices? Of course, the companies that produce most of our favorite chocolate bars. Mars, Nestle, Hershey's, Cadbury, Toblerone. All these companies are implicated in the chocolate trade that causes deforestation that does not ensure farmers receive a fair wage for their work, and as I will next demonstrate, contributes to child labor and poverty. You have to understand poverty is the number one driving force behind deforestation. It's been found that child labor is involved in the production of cacao in most of the world's largest cacao producing countries. Children as young as 8 years old have been found with machetes going out after school to cut down cacao pods. Some of the aforementioned companies like Mars, Ferrero, and Hershey expressed their collective commitment to combat child labor in cacao growing communities in West Africa. They came together to create what was called the Harkin Angle Protocol, aiming to reduce the worst forms of child labor in the cacao sector of Ivory Coast and Ghana by 70% of this year. However, it's very difficult to track the effects of such protocols. It's very difficult to hold large companies accountable, and it's very hard to regulate or track where cacao comes from once it has been turned into the final product. My recommendation is with this information, you carefully consider the choices that you're making at the supermarket when it comes to buying chocolate products. The Fair Trade and Rainforest certifications are a great place to start, and so is the Certified Organic certification. You can take an even bigger leap by ensuring that the companies from which you buy are direct trade certified. Direct trade ensures that the farmers get a higher portion of the crop price and that they're able to take that home and turn that into a valuable monetary return for their families, which in turn is going to limit deforestation and impact upon child labor. What that means, in short, is that when families are provided for and supported, there's less likelihood that child labor will be used in the production of cacao. Finally, I'd like to talk about the spiritual implications of cacao. In indigenous cultures, cacao is a plant medicine or an entheogen. It may not be as strong as ayahuasca or psilocybin, but it has powerful, potent effects on the body. Number one, it has a heart-opening quality, and it helps people connect into that spiritual center of their body and into the spiritual center of their being. Consider that very few people have experienced it in its raw organic form. Neuromodulators and neurotransmitters in beans can provide phenomenally powerful experiences. They're chock full of antioxidants. These include polyphenols and flavonoids, which are particularly helpful in fighting free radicals. Furthermore, there may be a link between chocolate consumption and cancer prevention. One animal model found that dark chocolate was able to effectively reduce the growth and spread of colon cancer cells in rats. As I mentioned before, there's a positive heart-opening quality of cacao. This is not only linked to the spiritual heart, but the physical heart as well. Flavonols, which I mentioned before, are the main type of flavonoid found in chocolate. According to the Cleveland Clinic, research has shown that flavonols have a very positive effect on heart health by reducing blood pressure and improving blood flow to the heart as well as the brain. They can prevent blood platelets from clotting, which can also reduce the risk of stroke. And for those buying chocolate at the market, I highly recommend buying dark chocolate because of higher nutrient density. Furthermore, a lot of people have an intolerance to lactose or some of the other components of milk like butyrophilin. So I recommend that anyone buying chocolate at the market check the label. Make sure there is no additive milk in the product you are buying unless you like milk chocolate, but generally that's loaded with sugar. So try to find a dark chocolate bar that's sweetened with stevia instead of coconut sugar or just cane sugar that we normally find in sweet products. This has been Zavi D of Organic Health Movement checking in to provide you a video on cacao. Hope you enjoyed it, shared with your friends,
Share it with your loved ones. Enjoy the day, and may all beings impacted by the cocoa trade be blessed with light, shelter, nourishment, healing, abundance, and love. Peace out.